Hello, personality and individual differences class. Let's wrap up our discussion of the introduction to personality. And so we're going to do two major things in this video. We are going to look at some major issues that are going to permeate through the rest of this class. We're going to encounter them time and time again. So let's discuss them now. And then we're going to discuss some questions, kind of tease what the rest of this class is going to be about, some interesting questions that we're going to try to answer throughout the rest of these lectures. Okay, question number one, and this is what we're going to spend the first half of this class trying to address. How do you study personality? What is the best way of studying personality? Now, in many scientific disciplines, there is a set way in which you conduct science in that discipline. In chemistry, there is the correct way of doing chemistry, and there is the wrong way of doing chemistry. And all scientists abide by one model of chemistry. In biology, in the field of medicine, there is one way of conducting studies to come up with vaccines or study viruses, and that's the way that all biologists or all medical students study viruses. Now, is it the same way in psychology? And the answer is no. There are many different approaches within the field of psychology, and it depends on exactly what we're studying. And even more fractionated is the field of personality. Different psychologists have different ways in which they think is the appropriate way to scientifically study things in psychology, things in personality. Okay, let me repeat that. There are many different camps within the field of personality that all think that they have the correct way of studying personality. Not only that, they think that people in other camps are doing it wrong and that they're doing it in an unscientific fashion, and that the other camp is missing out on a very important dimension of personality, that they're not studying it the right way. So let's back up a little bit, and let's talk about this term paradigm. So paradigm in the sciences has a number of different meanings, but let me give you the definition of paradigm in the philosophy of science. When we talk about paradigm in science, we're referring to the general approach in which scientists do their research. It's the common assumptions of that scientific discipline. It's the set of research methods, it's how they conduct experiments, who they use as subjects, what kind of confounding variables they control for. It is the statistical procedures that those scientists use, and the common ways of thinking that these scientists typically have. It's the typical explanations that they have. So it's in general, a paradigm is the way that scientists agree how they should conduct scientific research. If you are a biologist today, you have certain assumptions. So, for instance, every biologist today, if they want to be a biologist, has to agree with the theory of genetics. They have to argue about the importance of genetics in biology. They also have to agree with Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Biology, as it's conceptualized nowadays, only makes sense in light of Darwin's theory of natural selection. So one of the common assumptions, the common theory that all biologists agree on is Darwin's theory of natural selection. There's a certain statistical techniques that biologists use. There's certain research methods that biologists use. And we can think of this as the paradigm of biology. So some examples. So let me back up. Paradigms are going to dictate which research studies are considered good science, good studies to conduct. They're going to dictate what research questions can be answered and which research questions are valid research questions. That is a useful endeavor as opposed to a useless endeavor, and no one should conduct a research study that way. And they also dictate how someone's results of their experiment are going to be interpreted. So the paradigm dictates what research questions are useful, how we're going to interpret our data. The paradigm is very important for conducting a particular science. conducting research in a particular scientific discipline. So some examples of this, we might think of Newtonian physics. So physics, we essentially, after Newton and before Einstein and before all the theories of quantum mechanics. So if you were a physicist in the 1800s, for instance, you had to agree with all of Newton's laws. Newton's ideas of physics were the common assumptions. How you conducted experiments was in a very typical way. How you interpreted your results was in a very how you interpreted your results was in a way that was consistent with everybody else. We could think of maybe behaviorism as kind of a paradigm within psychology. So for behaviorists, they all studied learning. They all studied operant and classical conditioning, and they studied this using non-human animals for the most part. So pigeons, rats, and their idea was that they could explain most of human behavior via the principles of classical and operant conditioning. So this is very different than the way that we might conduct psychological studies today, although we still do a lot of non-human animal research. But we can think of a paradigm as dictating the kind of research questions, how researchers conduct scientific studies. On occasion, these paradigms change, and we call this a paradigm shift. So for instance, there's a good example of one within physics. So everybody agreed with Newton up until modern physics, where the discovery of quantum mechanics, well, not really discovery, but a lot of the quantum mechanics ideas and a lot of Einstein's ideas led to dramatic changes in how physicists conducted their research. Instead of looking at macroscopic objects like how balls or rockets move throughout the air, they were looking at microscopic objects and subatomic particles and how they interacted with one another. It was completely different research, a completely different way of conceptualizing the world of physics. We can also look at the difference in the study of disease. So we can look at the miasma model of disease, which the notion back in the day was that bad air caused a lot of illnesses, that if you breathed bad air, if you breathed some dead decaying human being, that would lead to illness. We can contrast that with the pathogenic model of human disease, where it's really these bacteria, it's really these viruses, these microscopic organisms that are leading to illness. So the way that individuals study disease, the way that they conceptualize these research studies on disease, vastly changed from the miasma paradigm to the microscopic virus bacteria paradigm. So why am I talking about paradigms in biology and paradigms in physics? What does this tell us about personality? Okay, we've got the paradigm shift of Newton to Einstein here. So some disciplines in psychology we could think of as maybe having a paradigm. In cognitive psychology, for instance, everybody takes, for the most part, an information processing approach to it. So they think of the human brain very much similar as a computer. They use the computer metaphor a lot. So we look at accuracy and we look at reaction times in human beings, and we infer what's going on inside a human being's mind. And again, we think of it very similar to a computer. So we can think of the information processing approach as being a major paradigm within cognitive psychology. How about personality? Is there a certain way to study personality? And the answer is no. There are many different camps within the field. There are many different camps in the study of personality that argue that their approach is the best and that everybody else's approach is dumb and unscientific and not really doesn't really capture all there is to know about personality. So we might call the discipline of personality psychology as pre-paradigmatic. By pre-paradigmatic, that is one of those fancy words that means that we don't have a paradigm yet within the field of personality. There's not one way to study personality. There's many, many different ways, and there's advantages and disadvantages of all of them. And we're just kind of coming to a point in the discipline of personality psychology where all personality psychologists can maybe agree on one or two different things. And it has been a long road to hoe, as we will see throughout this course. The discipline of personality has had a lot of bumps in the way. So there's not one way to study personality. There's many different ways. And the first half of this course, we're going to go through all of those different ways of studying personality. So some of those different approaches, we can look at psychodynamic approaches. These are approaches by individuals that are pretty famous within the discipline of psychology, although they don't actually use that much science. They do not really collect that much data. They're not using experiments. They're not really using research studies. They're relying on their gut and their intuition and their clinical practice to come up with these theories. So we can think of individuals like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, whose theories are very influential, but again, they're not really using science to come up with what these theories are. They're relying on their gut, their own personal history. So the psychodynamic approaches to personality, we'll encounter these first. We can look at the humanistic and motivation approaches to the study of personality, looking at different needs of human beings, looking at different motives and how these might vary. The trait approaches to personality, so looking at how many different personality traits are there. How do we measure these personality traits? What are these personality traits correlated with? All of that is within the trait approach. Biological approach, what brain areas are different that lead to differences in one's personality? Maybe if this brain area of the brain is larger than this other brain area, maybe that tells us something about how that person typically acts, feels, or thinks. Maybe we can look at differences in brain activity. And we can look at differences in the concentration of neurotransmitters or neurotransmitter systems in the brain. Maybe that tells us something about someone's personality. We will get to that. Maybe look at the genetics of personality. What do the behaviorists have to say about personality? So what can someone's early childhood experiences tell us about why they behave the way that they do, why they feel, think, behave the certain way that they do? So look at classical and operant conditioning early on in life, what that determines about someone's personality. Behaviorists don't really, they focus a lot on learning. They don't really focus that much on personality. They don't really measure personality that much. So while they might have some important ideas to contribute to the study of personality, they didn't study personality itself per se. And what do social and cognitive psychologists have to say about the study of personality? What are these social cognitive approaches, and what can they tell us about personality? All right, major theme number 2, again, something that we're going to encounter time and time again, is the difference between personality traits and personality types. There are many different theories that rely on personality traits. There's many different theories that rely on personality types. Now, what's the difference between these two, and is one of these conceptualizations about differences in personality better than the other one? So let's define these two. Personality traits. How is it different than a personality type? A personality trait is a quantitative, a mathematical difference in some dimension of personality. So people differ in their amount of a particular personality. So we can think of something maybe like extroversion. Maybe you're in the middle of extroversion. You're average in extroversion. Maybe you're in the top 10%. Maybe you're in the bottom 10%. So we can think of extroversion as being a continuous trait, and maybe it's something that's normally distributed. So here we have a normal distribution. We see here on the x-axis for the normal distribution, we have the score on a particular trait. These individuals over here score very high on it. Maybe this might be something like extroversion, so these individuals are very extroverted. These individuals over here are very introverted. And here we have people that are somewhat in the middle of the trait. The y-axis tells us the proportion or percentage of people that score that particularly high on that trait. So we see from this normal distribution that the majority of individuals score right smack dab in the middle. There's some individuals, but not very many, that score extremely high. And there's some individuals that score extremely low on this particular trait. We see that for the vast majority of individual differences in psychology, that things are normally distributed. And personality is no exception to this. For extroversion, if we were to measure this out, we see that the majority of individuals are smack dab in the middle. Some people are extremely extroverted, some people are very introverted, but most people are in the middle. So traits differ mathematically, they differ quantitatively. You might be in the 80th percentile, you might be in the 10th percentile of a particular trait, but they differ quantitatively. So you can be extremely extroverted, highly extroverted, moderately extroverted, whatever trait that we're looking at, okay? It's something that differs quantitatively. So that's personality traits. Now let's contrast this with a personality type. Personality type is a categorical difference. Instead of, differing in the amount of trait, you're either X or you're Y. So a good example of this is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which puts you as either an extrovert or an introvert. There's nobody in between. You're either one or you're the other. Another good example of this might be your astrological sign. So you are an Aries, you are a Scorpio. You're not in the middle. There's no between category dimensions. It's not mathematical. You're either one or you're the other. Maybe we can look at your house in Harry Potter and what that tends to tell you about your personality. Are you a Slytherin or are you a Gryffindor? Okay, you're one or you're the other. You're not half a Slytherin, half a Gryffindor. That's not what the Sorting Hat tells you in the Harry Potter books and the Harry Potter movies. So these are two different conceptualizations of dimensions of personality. So it might differ quantitatively. So you're in the 30th percentile of agreeableness. Or maybe we have different personality types. Maybe you're type A or type B, something that you might have heard about before. So there's these two different conceptualizations of personality dimensions. Which one of these is correct? Which one of these is better than the other one? And there is a correct answer to that question. Think about it for a second. Which one of these does a better job of conveying someone's dimension in a particular characteristic of their personality? And the answer to that is personality traits do a much better job of this than personality types. If you are smack dab in the middle of extroversion, well, the Myers-Briggs doesn't know where to put you. It's either going to put you as introvert or it's going to put you as an extrovert. When neither of those describe your personality, you're smack dab in the middle. The personality trait conceptualization of this does a much better job of it. It's going to say, hey, you're average in extroversion. So traits do a much better job of conceptualizing someone's personality. They do a much better job of predicting if you're going to do better at a particular job, if you're going to fit well with a particular group of people. Traits just do a better job of that, and we're going to describe why that's the case a little bit later on when we get to talk about the Myers-Briggs type indicator in much more detail, and when we talk about research methods and statistics within the field of personality. Traits just do a better job because you can be average in that particular trait. Not only can you be average in that particular trait, for the Myers-Briggs, they assume that all introverts are exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you are slightly below the cutoff for introvert or you're extremely low in extroversion. They assume that you're an introvert, you're exactly the same. There's no variability within that category, within that type, when that is not true. As I mentioned before, if we look at any dimension in personality, it's pretty much normally distributed. Doesn't matter what we're looking at, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, all that is normally distributed. Traits do a much better job than types. But why is it the case then that people, the lay public, many non-psychologists love personality types? They love them. They would much prefer to talk about types as opposed to traits. Myers-Briggs type indicator, probably the most famous personality test. Astrology signs, again, very, very popular. Sorting hat, very popular. Why do we like to conceptualize personality as the lay public in terms of types as opposed to traits? Well, here's the reason. First of all, with traits, they differ between one another quantitatively. So you might be in the upper 10% or the upper 20% of extroversion. Try explaining the difference of that to your grandma. Well, are you extroverted? Well, yeah, I'm extroverted than most people. I'm in the upper 10%. It's going to be hard for grandma to wrap her head around that. So there's not these neat little buckets of I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert. It's easy to talk about the differences between those two different camps. It's easier to explain personality types compared to personality traits, whereas personality traits reflect the reality of differences in personality compared to personality types. So I hope that makes sense. We'll talk about this in much more detail, but types are easier to explain to one another. Human beings like to think about things in terms of dichotomies. So black versus white, good versus evil, all this sort of stuff. They like to think about things in terms of this extreme or this extreme. It's easier to think about things in terms of that. Is this person a good person or is this person a bad person? Well, I don't want to think that hard about it. Let me just put them into this category or this category. Human beings are by nature cognitively lazy. So this is why we come up with so many typologies. That's why the lay public likes typologies. But as I mentioned before, personality is normally distributed for the most part. So it turns out that typologies, for the most part, wrong, and for the most part do an insufficient job of describing someone's personality, especially if we're trying to use measures of personality to predict who's going to do well at a job. We're trying to get measures of personality to predict actual real-world outcomes. Traits do a much more better job than types. This leads me to something that's very popular nowadays, and this is the Enneagram, which is something that you might have heard. Oh man, I get on Facebook, or if I get on anything, and I hear a lot of talk about the Enneagram. It has become a much more popular test than the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator in the past decade or so. The Enneagram, literally, Ennea in Greek means 9, gram means writing, so there are 9 different types of personality according to the Enneagram. So there's the reformer, the helper, the achiever, the individualist, the investigator, the loyalist, the enthusiast, the challenger, and the peacemaker. And you take a test. There are many different tests for this. There are many different tests for the Enneagram to come up with what your Ennea type is, 1 through 9. And the Enneagram has a huge spiritual component to it. There are many books that relate the Enneagram to uncovering who you are spiritually as a person. There's plenty of information about the Enneagram out there. Is this a good measure of personality? Not really. Is it measuring some true dimensions in personality? Yes, it is measuring some true dimensions in someone's personality, why people differ compared to somebody else. But are there 9 neatly divided subtypes of someone's personality? No, there is not. Personality is continuous. There's many different traits that are out there. The Enneagram fits you into one of these 9 different categories, but perhaps it's the case that you're half a reformer and half an enthusiast. The Enneagram doesn't know where to fit you, so it puts you in one compared to the other. And as we've mentioned before, this does not do a very good job of accurately describing what someone's personality is like. Many times someone is somewhere between some of these types. So we're not going to talk a lot about the Enneagram. To be honest, there's not much scientific research to back it up. And even though it might be measuring some real differences in personality, it is not doing it in a way that's better than some of the more traditional measures of personality that are more reliable and valid. If you don't know what reliable and valid means, we'll learn a lot about how to evaluate good personality measures and bad personality measures when we get to research methods and statistics within the field of personality. So, is the Enneagram fun? Yes. Does it help you learn something about yourself? Yes. Does it do a better job of it than other measures of personality? No. In fact, it is an easier way to describe personality. There's 9 different types compared to I am in the 70th percentile of agreeableness and the 50th percentile in openness to experience. That's harder to describe to somebody. So it's more fun to talk about things in terms of types. That doesn't necessarily mean that the psychological reality of things is in terms of personality types as opposed to personality traits. So I hope I didn't burst your bubble too much with that, but there's going to be a lot of that in this class. The difference between personality types that we love to explain, the differences between human beings, and traits, which is a more accurate representation of differences in personality. Okay, let's move on and give you a few different questions that we're going to try to answer throughout this class. First, the question that we're going to tackle right off the bat, how do you measure personality? There's many different ways out there to measure personality. Which of those ways is the best? Which of those ways are good? Which of those ways are bad? There's ways that we can evaluate this. You don't just come up with a personality test off the top of your head and say, I think it's good. There's ways to evaluate it. There's scientific, empirical, data-driven ways of making sure that your test is a good test and that it's not complete BS. And you'd be surprised, there's a lot of BS tests out there that don't do a very good job of measuring personality. And yet, Fortune 500 companies and other places will purchase these tests for thousands upon thousands of dollars, even though the test does a inadequate job of measuring personality. So a good example of leading into that is the Rorschach ink blot test. Here we show you an ink blot. And based off of what you think this ink blot is, we might be able to infer something about your personality. So do you see, with this ink blot, do you see 2 pigs? Do you see a pelvis? Do you see a butterfly? Do you see a moth? Based off of what you tell me, some psychologists have argued we're able to infer some characteristics of your personality. So maybe you tell me that this looks like a butterfly. Maybe I say, well, that means that you are an energetic person. So this is a category of test known as a projective test. And we'll talk a little bit about projective test. Projective test, we give you an ambiguous stimulus. You interpret that ambiguous stimulus, and based off of your interpretation, we know something about your personality. Is the Rorschach ink blot test a good test? No. It really is not, and we'll talk about why that's the case. But do we use projective test, or maybe we do something like this test? Maybe we ask people for self-report. We give them questions, and then they tell us how much they agree with the particular statement and whether or not it is similar to their own personality. So I enjoy meeting new people. Do I agree with that statement? Do I strongly agree? Am I unsure, or I have no opinion, or I'm somewhere in the middle? Do I disagree? Do I strongly disagree? Okay, this is a self-report measure. And because it has these different categories here, we call it a Likert scale, a Likert scale. So this is a 5-point Likert scale. There's 5 different options for you, from strongly disagree, disagree, unsure, agree, strongly agree. We could have a 7-point Likert scale: strongly disagree, moderately disagree, slightly disagree, no opinion, slightly agree, moderately agree, strongly agree. There's many different Likert scales that we can have out there for these self-reports. There are advantages and disadvantages of these different tests. First of all, you can cheat on this test. You can make it seem like you are better fit for the job than you might actually be. Do you enjoy meeting new people? Perhaps you hate other human beings, but you say strongly agree because you want the job. Whereas for the Rorschach ink blot test, good job guessing what answer you need to give to do well on this test, right? So this you might not even think is a measure of personality, whereas this one you think it is. This, how do you easily interpret if they see a pelvis or they see a piglet or whatever it is, compared to how they respond to the self-report, the Likert scale. I'm saying Likert because that is the way that Likert, the individual that created these tests, said his name. There's some psychologists that call these Likert scales, and they are wrong. Okay, there's some people in the department that call these Likert scales, and you have my permission to make fun of them, or not make fun of them, but say, well, Professor Harrison says it's a Likert scale, because I'm right. I'm just kidding. I am right, but I'm just poking fun of people. Okay, so how do we measure personality? That's a good question. How do we evaluate which personality measures are good that we should spend our money on, and which personality measures are crap and we should not pay attention to what they have to say? Huge debate in the field of personality. What causes behavior? If you're the kind of person that likes to go out to parties or is very agreeable, or you get into lots of arguments, what causes that particular behavior? Is it the person? Is it your personality? Or is it the situation that you're in? Do you argue? Are you currently in an argument because you are a disagreeable person, you're a very aggressive person? Or is it because someone said something to you that made you mad? And everybody in that situation would be mad. So why do you behave a certain way? Why did you cheat on a particular test? Is it because you have some moral deficiency? So some characteristic of your personality is lacking, or there's some differences in personality that leads someone to cheat versus not cheat? Or is it due to the situation? Well, just because the test is difficult, everybody's going to cheat on it. So what of these is correct? Now, if you are a keen student of psychology, you already know the answer. I would say that 70% of the time in psychology, the answer, it depends, or both, is the correct answer. And this is no exception. Does the person matter, or does the situation matter? Both matter. But there's a huge debate in the late 1960s and 1970s within the field of personality that's known as the person versus situation debate as to which of these two, personality or the situation, the psychological situation, dictate how a person behaves. In the late 1960s, an infamous book was published by Walter Mischel. Here we have Walter Mischel. We'll talk a lot about Walter Mischel and his research on personality and social psychology a little bit later. He published this book that's called Personality and Assessment. Now, if you were a betting person, you would assume that this textbook has to do with, I don't know, personality and how to assess it. But you would be wrong. This entire textbook is the equivalent, the academic equivalent of a rap diss track. So Walter Mischel publishes his book and says that the field of personality is useless. The field of personality is useless. That it's really the psychological situation that completely dictates how somebody behaves. He argued that we can't accurately measure personality, and that personality doesn't predict real-world behavior. And if personality doesn't predict real-world behavior, why should we even bother studying personality? He argued that there's many different studies at the time that showed the importance of the psychological situation. A good example of this that you've probably encountered from general psychology is Stanley Milgram's studies of obedience. I'll go over Milgram's studies of obedience very quickly, and I might toss up some videos of Milgram's obedience studies if you've forgotten about them. So what Milgram was interested in, he had some family members that had survived the Holocaust, and he was interested in why is it the case that people can be convinced to do such horrible actions like kill an entire ethnic group. So how can relatively good people be convinced to do horrible things? Is it because they're morally deficient, or is it the case that there's something else that's happening here? Well, Milgram conducted this study in which two people come to the research study. One of them is a true participant that does not know what the study is about. The other is a confederate, an actor. They are in cahoots with the experimenter. They're going to behave a particular way in this study. The study is supposedly about learning and memory. And the participants, the confederate and the actual participant, are randomly assigned to roles as a teacher or a learner. In this study, the true participant is always the teacher. The confederate, the actor, is always the learner. The learner is hooked up to an electrical device that will shock them whenever the teacher flips a particular switch. So the teacher, the true participant, gives the learner some things to remember, and if the learner gets them wrong, the teacher has to flip a switch that is going to deliver an electrical shock to the learner. Now, in actuality, no electrical shock is being administered. The actor is just faking like an electrical shock is being administered. But the teacher does not know that. The true participant does not know that. As the learner gets more and more questions wrong, memory items wrong, the teacher is supposed to flip these certain switches on this device that's going to deliver a more and more intense electrical shock to the learner, the actor. Of course, they're not actually being shocked. At a certain point in time, the learner starts complaining of a heart condition. Say, hey, I've got a bad heart. I want to stop this experiment. As they continue on, at a certain point in time, the learner passes out, or passes out. They don't really pass out. And of course, if you're passed out, you can't get these items correct. So the teacher supposedly has to go and finish shocking the participant, all the way to a lever that's labeled XXX, which supposedly will kill the learner. Now, the dependent variable in this research study is how far does the teacher go? How far do they flip these switches? Do they go all the way and supposedly kill the learner? Or do they quit the study? Now, the experimenter is in the room, and if the teacher says, hey, I want to stop the study, the experimenter says, one of four things. One of those things is the study must continue. And does the teacher just finally say, nope, I'm not doing it, I refuse? Or do they continue with the study, supposedly delivering a lethal dose of electricity, of electrical shock to the learner? Surprisingly enough, in this study, is 63% of subjects go all the way to the lever marked XXX. They go all the way to the end of the study. And that's very counterintuitive about human nature, that if an authority figure tells you to do some atrocious act to another human being, that you are capable of doing this. A lot of people would not have predicted the results of Stanley Milgram's experiment. Now, what Walter Mischel argues is that if we can get relatively good people to do horrible things, it's not personality that dictates behavior, it's the situation that matters. For instance, if there is an authority figure in the room, the authority figure dictates how their subordinates are going to interact or how they're going to act. So, does personality matter? Does the situation matter? This is a thing that we're going to try to solve when we get to the module of the person versus situation debate. Another important question in personality: how many different traits are there? How many different dimensions of personality are there? Are there 5 traits? Are there 3 traits? Are there 19 traits? There's many different theories out there. How do you go about objectively coming up with how many traits there are? There are 20,000 adjectives in the English language that describe someone's personality. Does that mean that all of these different adjectives are referring to different personality traits, or are they referring to some of the same personality traits? How do we determine how many traits are there? Is there a statistical procedure? Think about that right now. If you were a personality theorist, how would you go about determining how many different personality traits there are? Are there 5? Are there 16? How do you experimentally or research-wise come to that conclusion? How would you do that if you didn't know how people did that in the past? We were talking about personality types earlier. How do you come up with how many personality types there are? Is there a statistical way to do that? Think about how you would try to conduct that research study. So how many personality traits are there? How do we even conduct this research. We'll encounter that when we talk about trait theories of personality. A good example of this, the adjectives gregarious, sociable, personable, outgoing. Do those all refer to different personality traits? Or maybe it's the case that they all refer to the same personality trait. Maybe it's extroversion. Maybe it's the case that we mean something slightly different if we call someone personable compared to if we call them outgoing. Is that true? How do we capture that difference? Another question, the age-old question in psychology that you have encountered time and time again, especially if you've had human growth and development, is personality determined by nature or is it by nurture? Is personality determined by your genes? Or is it determined by your nurture, how you were raised by your parents, the early childhood events that you encountered as a toddler, as a child? If you've had human growth and development, you know the answer to this question is almost always, it depends / both. I told you 70% of the time, the correct answer to questions in psychology is it depends or both. And here again, we find that that's the case. Personality is no different. Personality is both determined by one's genes and it's determined by one's nurture. So we'll talk about the different, when does nature matter more, when does nurture matter more, what specific early childhood events impact your personality, what specific genes impact your personality a little bit later on when we talk about the biological approach to personality. How about the question of aging? Is personality consistent? If you are a very agreeable kid, do you end up being a very agreeable older adult? How much change is there in personality? How much stability is there in personality? If you are a very anxious kid, do you develop to be a very anxious adult? What lifehood events lead you to change your personality? How about all human beings as they age? What's our stereotype of young adults compared to our stereotype of older adults? Is it the case that as people age, they become more agreeable? They become nicer, or maybe they become more crotchety, right? There's stereotypes of both of those about older adults. Which of those is true? Or maybe it's neither of them. Maybe there's no change in all human beings as they age. Do people get more open to new ideas as they age? Or do they become less open to new ideas as they age? These are some questions that we're going to try to address when we talk about personality change and stability right after test 2, if memory serves. The last thing, probably the most practical question that we can address, so what? What practical applications does personality have? Why should we bother studying personality? I mean, there's plenty of basic research. There's plenty of basic research of why we would want to study personality. But how about the practical applications? My wife works at Home Depot, and they have a personality assessment that anybody that wants to apply and work at a Home Depot, they take a personality assessment, and if you're a good fit for the job, you're more likely to be hired than if you do not have a good fit for the job based off of your personality. So if they're going to, I mean, it's a good practice to have if personality predicts who's going to be a good employee, who's going to be a bad employee. But for that to happen, we need to know what personality traits lead to someone who's going to be a good worker, who's going to be a bad worker. And if we know these personality traits, well, then we might want to select for individuals that have those personality traits to be in a particular job. Who needs to be in a position of leadership or a position of power? It's very important for a company to promote people that are going to be successful leaders. They're not going to exploit their power as a leader. So how do we select individuals for management training? These are very practical applications of personality, and in the real world, these are where you're going to see legitimate personality measures. So what's the practical application of the study of personality? We'll talk about that as well. Because if personality does not predict anything in the real world, well then why are we even bothering studying it? Okay, so these are all things that we're going to address throughout this course. I hope you're excited. I know I am. Have a good first day with the summer classes, and I will talk with you guys later, and we'll start talking about research methods. I know you're excited about that. Woohoo! Okay, talk with you guys later.